Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. When talking about the way that black men and black women coincide in the community, we often run into a huge obstacle. Since time immemorial, we talk about the importance of manhood and the responsibilities that come along with that. However, as the warrior scholar Khalid Muhammad said, you can't have a god without a goddess. Black men and black women must help to balance one another. To try to do it without one or the other is like having a bird with only one wing. Yesterday, we took a look at what makes for a strong black man and what makes for a weak one. Today, we're going to be discussing what makes for a strong black woman and what makes for a weak one. First of all, we need to understand that the world has largely changed due to economic factors. That's the reason why we, the new voices of black media, spend so much time talking about finance, talking about money, talking about the economy, because that's what runs the world that we live in. Up until the 19th century, most of the job fields that built the societies of the world required muscle power, mud, and math. As a result, there weren't too many women who were involved in those fields. Usually they were doing lighter work. However, that came to an end with the 19th century and the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Societal trends follow economic ones. For all of human history up until the last 120 years or so, a woman's ability to earn a living was tied directly to her husband. This is why in the Bible and other ancient stories, when you come upon a widow, she's always portrayed as the poorest of the poor. There was no social safety net in the time of Jesus. This is an important point to make because it meant that a woman's survival and prosperity was directly tied to her choice of mate. There were no desk jobs, no office work, and no jobs as a model for a woman to pursue. So if a woman made a poor choice of mate or got herself pregnant with some clown's child, decided to stay single, or just had the poor fortune of her husband dying, then her financial prospects dropped significantly and immediately, along with her chances of living. This harsh reality acted as a check on women using their genitals as their power. Making stupid or ill-considered choices with one's sexuality carried immediate and life-altering consequences. This is how it was for all of human history up until a little over a century ago. This is why female culture was geared around women making themselves acceptable to a husband by practicing submissiveness, maturity, chastity, temperance, things like that. Women who tried to be party girls wound up living lives that were poor, harsh, and oftentimes short. It's important for us to understand that women who try to use sex as their power are weak. Sex power is easy power because you don't have to do anything to acquire it. You don't have to do anything to earn it. You simply got it just because. However, it's also temporary power too. It's power for women who lack the initiative or the character to cultivate any skills. Up until the modern age, any woman who tried to use sex as her power relegated herself to the level of a harlot, and that meant they wound up like the poor old widow. Sure, when your reputation takes a hit and no man looks at you as wife material, you can go ahead and do something strange for some change while you're young. But that game runs out, because everything that used to wiggle and jiggle inevitably will start sagging and dragging, and when that day comes, you go from bartering your booty to begging for money. For all of human civilization up until very recently, when a woman was living wrong, she suffered immediate consequences for those poor choices. I repeat that because this cushy, largely consequence-free existence is all that most women have ever known, and you need to be reminded this has been the exception, not the rule. Everything changed with the Industrial Revolution, at least for women in the Western world. When women were able to enter the workforce in appreciable numbers, they had a chance to earn income because they were finally a plethora of paying jobs that didn't involve muscle power, mud, or math. As a result, the immediate financial consequences that went along with whorehouse behavior were greatly reduced. Sure, they wouldn't live like a queen, but at least they no longer had to fear the fate of the pitiful widow. The reason that men were so easily able to set societal norms is because there were immediate consequences that went along with breaking those norms. Those consequences were the natural order. But that had changed. Now, no woman had to fear what had historically been the worst and most immediate consequences for such behavior. And then in the 1960s, there was a social movement geared around making this degradation an honorable thing. And this has set the frame for what we loosely call womanhood on the few occasions that the word is mentioned. Now, there's something that needs to be understood about sex as a woman's power. That's the female equivalent of a man who tries to use violence as his power. A man who tries to use sex as his power usually winds up in prison or some spineless male concubine. Men don't have the ability to do that. Women who try to use violence as their power wind up in a hospital or worse. Women who try to reach for sex as their power show themselves as weak, the same as a man who tries to reach for violence as his. A strong woman disciplines herself. She brings her emotional impulses under control. A strong woman understands that she has to utterly subdue her caprice, because a woman who doesn't control herself tends to seek out men who will accept a loose woman like that. A disciplined man, however, won't. A weak woman seeks out some Pookie or Ray Ray because she can control him. He'll be dependent on her. A weak woman makes every mistake imaginable, then claims that there's no good men out there, when the reality is she failed to make herself worthy of a good man and refuses to take responsibility for that. Many of the female dating gurus fall in that category. A strong woman understands that character must come first. When dealing with any man, her first consideration is whether or not he's a good person. A strong woman will naturally look for character first. She's attracted to it because she is a person of character herself. There's no substitute for that. As a community, we require our womanhood, but too many people have found it convenient to dismiss this part of the subject. We need to have an ongoing and persistent conversation regarding the responsibilities of womanhood. Black women need to be pushing this particular dialogue amongst themselves because that's where it's going to be the most effective. Now, we know that a lot of black women shy away from that because this is not a popular subject to raise. Why? This reluctance is largely rooted in the dynamics of female group behavior. Women as a group tend to be conformists. This is the reason why when they get together, you notice that they follow the same hair trends, makeup trends, fashion trends, etc. Conformity can be useful in moderation, but when it comes to a situation that's bad and getting worse, conformity becomes a suicide pact. Weak black women know that when you start talking about character, that's something that basically eliminates them from the conversation, so they don't want anyone bringing up the issue at all. The society has allowed this fallacy that women's only problem are the men in their lives. This is a white media fantasy. It's not true at all. But for the last almost 80 years, we've seen it pushed nonstop through the television shows, movies, oftentimes books and magazines, politicians, and even from the pulpits. This endless repetition of white media propaganda has conditioned many black women to automatically blame the man in their lives or to blame black men for not being around. Remember when racist Lena Dunham lied about Odell Beckham Jr.? She lied through her teeth and claimed that she felt so degraded and dehumanized because he didn't look at her. Not because of something he did, but because he didn't do something. She went on this BS-laden rant with all these asinine remarks about how she could tell what he was thinking. Apparently, this empty-headed gerbil is a telepath, saying stuff like, he was like, that's a marshmallow, that's not shaped like a woman, etc. She said all that about a black man who literally didn't say a word to her and didn't even look in her direction. Now, I'm sure that we can all agree that Lena Dunham is a weak, racist dog, but she does mirror weak women in the way that instead of looking at herself and getting herself in shape, taking care of her appearance, make herself acceptable to a man, try working on her social skills. Instead, she tries to play the victim because she doesn't want to have to do the work of improving herself. That is the hallmark of a weak woman. Lena Dunham is the antithesis of womanhood, just like Lizzo and Cardi B. But how do you tell women that WAP is the opposite of womanhood in this social climate? What constitutes womanhood in the society has tragically not been solidly defined. It certainly hasn't been deeply ingrained. It's been more a generalized set of principles and ideas, a loosely worded concept. Naturally, we've had a lot of bad actors who have taken full advantage of that. The things that the white media and the bottom-feeding bootlicks and hood rats have tried to tell us constitutes womanhood is merely poison, which too many people have chosen to take. And it gets worse when you have black men who have no excuse for not knowing better, who reinforce this poison. Be very careful who you take advice from. What tickles your ears can wind up kicking your behind. A weak woman simply cannot judge a man by how he behaves towards women. A black man who claims to have it all together but spends most of his time pushing a dialogue of cupcaking, that's not masculinity. That's at best, or rather worst, 6-figure or 7-figure simping. A man like that tends to abuse women the first time things don't go his way, They abuse women emotionally, sexually, psychologically, and even physically. A strong woman takes responsibility for not putting herself in a position like that. A strong woman recognizes a respect-worthy man, and she reciprocates that respect because she understands the male principle and she genuinely values it. A number of fraudulent talking points get kicked around on this subject, and some of them have taken root. Well, call me the weed man, because I'm going to rip these lies out of the ground. One lie that gets spouted far too often is that rich people don't get divorced anywhere near as much as poorer people. This particular talking point has been said so much even in places like this that it's become axiomatic. It doesn't even get questioned. And that's a shame, because one of the things I've always taught you is to never take things you hear at face value. What are the main reasons given for divorce? Do you know? According to the National Institute of Health's website, their study shows that the number one reason was lack of commitment, followed by extramarital affairs. Well, it makes sense that that would rate very high on the list of reasons for divorce. After all, we live in the age of hooking up. Too much conflict and arguing. You can attribute that to people who insist on having it all their own way, who can't compromise on anything. But it can also mean that they argue about things like their partner cheating on them or finances. In my opinion, that's a phrase that's a little bit too vague to be useful, but we'll move on. Next is getting married too young. That's number 4. And financial problems is number 5. That's important because we've been conditioned to think that financial problems is the number one reason for divorce. But it's actually not. Now, around these parts, we place a big emphasis on resources because that's how we're being oppressed. But when it comes to marriage, it's a lie to say that finances are the main thing that breaks marriages apart. Oh, but they were arguing about finances! That's what the lazy-brained will try to say. And why are their finances in disarray, Mr. Expert? Perhaps because the wife has a drug habit, or spends too much of the family's money, the old retail therapy, or perhaps the husband likes to gamble the money away or splurge on things he doesn't really need. It's a minority of marriages that break up because one spouse got up one day, felt that they're not making enough money, and is usually the woman who jumps ship, looking for a spouse who hopefully makes more money. Couples almost never argue about not making enough money. Usually the argument's about what are we going to do about it. That's where the disagreements come in until eventually the relationship can't take the stress. 85% of the time, their arguments are about what's being done with or not being done with the money they're making. Arguments about finances are always arguments about one spouse or the other's lifestyle choices. One spouse accusing the other of spending too much or refusing to spend the money in this or that manner. It's usually an inability to agree on what ought to be done with their earnings. And it is this unwillingness to compromise or change those lifestyle choices that eventually leads to the divorce. I know this is a very different conversation than the discourse you're used to hearing from the usual quarters, but this is what happens when you actually dig for the information. And you know I'm right. We're told that the most cited reason for divorce is financial issues, but I've now shown you that's not true. With a shrinking economy, stagnant wages, and the national wealth being maldistributed to the upper 1%, the stress of making ends meet will be most acute for the people with the least resources, and that will put pressure on the relationship, certainly. But again, every marital argument about money is actually about some underlying antagonism. I guess it's simply too complex for some experts to figure out that correlation doesn't equal causation. Lower income couples do get divorced more often, but they're also much more likely to also have the other more commonly cited traits of people who get divorced, mainly that they got married very young. What other factors are at play other than their income bracket? As it turns out, plenty. Forbes ran a story back in 2021 about the divorce rate among the 50 richest people in the United States. And what they found is that the divorce rate among these ultra-billionaires is 49%, which is higher than the national average, which is between 40 and 50%. So you have a conservative publication saying that once you get above the upper middle class, the divorce rates fall in line with the less affluent lower rungs of the income ladder. Well, there's something the ultra-rich and the working poor have in common after all. Financial success seems to improve your odds of marital success until you reach the upper echelons. Then your marriage success plummets. Do the people who tell you that the more money you make, the less likely you are to divorce ever point this out? Probably not. Have they even bothered to look? Probably not. Poorer people tend to have lower education. They're also more impulsive. They get married earlier, in large part because they weren't in college or in trade school after they left high school, and due to their lack of maturity, they're more likely to get divorced. My point is that there's plenty of factors that go into divorce other than having to do with one's W-2 forms. Personality conflicts are a far higher factor in divorce than finances. I guess I had to go around the world like that simply to make the point that character does matter and needs to come first. But then again, a strong black woman already understands that. See, to hear it from some people, the conversation about relationships revolves entirely around fancy dinners and vacations. There's nothing wrong with either one of those things by themselves, but tell me, is the foundation for a marriage based on that? Is that the bedrock that a marriage rests on, fancy dinners and vacations? No. So why is it that some of the people we hear talking never talk about what a successful marriage is based on? Perhaps because they don't know or don't care. That's fine for them, but should you take advice from people who focus only on what a marriage isn't about while totally ignoring what it is based on? I know that there's a number of dating gurus and other would-be advisors who try to give out that kind of hog spit, but you need to dismiss it. Anyone who tries to convince you that the fancy dinners and vacation spiel is somehow practicing for marriage, they're actually doing nothing but helping you practice for a divorce. They only say that because they're trying to make women weak by catering to their lower instincts. But over here in the House of Truth, we don't do that. If a man is focusing on maximizing his income, he's going to have to work a lot of hours. That's what maximum income requires. He won't have time for fancy dinners, and he'll only have limited time for vacations because those things all take him away from his mission. And is his mission the same one you're on? For a strong black woman, the answer is absolutely. But for a weak black woman, the answer would be maybe. A strong black woman doesn't try to base her relationship on eating out. A large part of what cements your womanhood is making sure that your husband and children have home-cooked meals. Home cooking is a key part of being a strong woman, and before you discount that, consider this. Why is there a child obesity crisis in the United States? It's because for the last 30 years, mothers have been feeding their children from processed foods at the grocery store or from the drive-in. A strong woman understands that a child is supposed to be fed by their mother, not McDonald's. And the same goes for your husband. A strong woman can handle selecting food from the produce section and not the aisles. And she's also strong enough to handle food prep, and she knows how to properly cook the food her family eats. Cat Williams, the comedian, talked about how he has a very large family, and that oftentimes he's the one who prepares meals for his children, which includes a number of daughters, each with their own different eating habits. Now, if a comedian who spends much of his time away from home can do it, then a strong black woman certainly can too. The most meaningful meals you're going to have will be at home, not at the Red Lobster. A weak woman doesn't know how to cook because she never learned how to take care of herself. A strong black woman, however, savors the smell of food cooking in her house because that's a key part of making a house a home, and that's what cements her womanhood. Sugar babies, Barbies, or boss bees can't be homemakers. If a woman can't be bothered to prepare meals for her man, then she's a liar if she claims she's able to satisfy him in any other way. See, the fancy dinners and vacation spiel is how I expect a child to talk, or an adolescent who's never been married. And you have black people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and olders who give this advice to black women to go in this direction, and they'll even tell black men that this is something we ought to pursue. Recognize when you're getting bad advice. I just wish this type of bad advice was limited to Steve Harvey, but it's not. It infects the internet and everybody is there. Remember what I said a few days ago about how the conservative movement has used right-wing hate radio and Fox News to feed their base political red meat? Well, the same dynamic goes for relationship advice. The people who peddle this poison cater to a largely female audience and feed them their own version of red meat. A strong woman won't let a Pied Piper appeal to her most immature instincts. A strong woman understands that a man's purpose is not to spoil her, it's to lead her. And he does this with character, intelligence, and resources. A strong black woman doesn't want to be spoiled because she knows that something that's been spoiled is good for absolutely nothing. A mature adult woman wants to be treated, but she doesn't want to be spoiled. Too many times we've had black women fall for the siren song of these online dating gurus and taking relationship advice from dating books. The purpose of these books and these gurus is to sell copies of their material. That's how they make their money. They're not going to tell you anything that they think is going to make you less inclined to buy their book or to buy their online course or what have you, so they lie. They tell you that a relationship is about you getting gifts from a man, and this deranges women's expectations to the point that now women think if they get dinner, they've had a successful relationship. That's how low the bar has become. It's not about companionship. It's about what did I get him to give me for free. Now, the 6- and 7-figure simps will play right along with that because that's the only way that they can get the time of day from a woman, and weak women will go for that. But a strong black woman won't. The main reason why marriages fail is that at least one of the parties involved had no understanding of what a marriage is. Marriage is not a lifelong date. It's not about being spoiled or living some faux idle rich lifestyle. A husband is not a sugar daddy. If you think he is, or that he ought to be, then do you really want to be a wife, or do you just want to be a sugar baby? If you're a sugar baby, then you can't complain when he treats you like one. No man commits to a sugar baby. You have to be a wife to get commitment, and only a strong black woman can be a wife. A weak, immature little girl can only be a sugar baby. A woman like that is basically a second child. The man may not necessarily divorce her, but he won't respect her either. A weak black woman makes her marriage decisions based on whether or not the guy gives her a tingle south of her personal equator. A strong black woman, on the other hand, decides whether to marry someone based on, first of all, what kind of character does he have? Has this man established anything for himself come second, or is he clearly in the process of doing so? If he's got nothing going, then this is not going to be a good fit. Unfortunately, for most black women, that's not the conversation that actually takes place. The decision is usually made most times according to their circle of gal pals, who, by the way, are usually all single or happily divorced. A strong black woman is mature. She knows right from wrong. She knows what's in her best interest, and she makes her decisions based on that, not based on what's going to get a giggle or an approving smile from her single girlfriends. The peer group has been arguably the most poisonous and disastrous thing in most women's lives. Too many women dress based on what their friends think. They make decisions based on what their friends think, and they choose who they date or marry or who they decide not to date or marry based on what their friends think. Be honest, sisters, how many of you consciously threw away the best man that came into your life mainly because you had one eye on him, but you had another eye and both of your ears on what your gal pals were thinking? A few weeks ago, we talked about Jonathan Majors and John Morant and how black men need to control who they let in their circle. Well, this advice goes double for black women. A strong black woman understands that as her life changes, her circle must change also. The same way you shouldn't be around a man who isn't building, you also shouldn't be around other females who aren't building families either. Sisters, men and women both have things we need to work on. That's just a fact. But we have to be honest about how society has developed the last 100 years. We spent far too much time talking only about the male side of the ledger. And this overemphasis on what black men need to work on has created the total misimpression that apparently black women must be okay, otherwise people would be saying something. But I'm sorry to tell you, sisters, that's not the case. And because the female side of the ledger has gone unexamined for so long, it comes as a shock when someone actually says, well, let's take a look at it. Many black women will be able to handle the reality, but others are going to predictably react with denial or disbelief. Oh, you must be a misogynist or whatever, because no one has said anything up until now. Actually, black men have been saying something, but we've had a malicious white media who has attacked those who speak up or silenced them altogether. And we've even had those who, unintentionally or not, have contributed to the problem. I know this is jarring to finally come to this discussion, but we're going to have it sooner or later so we can proceed forward together. As the leaders of our group, black men are the ones who set the standard for acceptable manhood and acceptable womanhood. The leader sets the standard for his group because he's the one who's charged with the duty of getting that group to where they need to go. Now, I'm sure that every black woman in the sound of my voice will agree that black manhood cannot and must not be just any old thing. that it cannot be left to every single black man to decide for himself what he thinks constitutes manhood. There must be some sort of standard, and that standard has to have an enforcement mechanism behind it. The problem is that's exactly what womanhood has come to mean. Every woman gets to decide for herself what she thinks it means, and that definition is almost always something that doesn't require responsibility. It requires no accountability. You don't have to do anything. Well, under that standard, the first thing that goes out the window is character. What we've seen for decades now has been the lowest common denominator dragging all women down to their level. The meaning of womanhood has been left undefined for so long that it has no meaning now. We don't even mention it. Out of sight, out of mind. Now, that's fine for the bushikas and the arrogant type of black females that we see, usually in government, but it also makes it where the essential bonds that black men and black women need in order to operate together have been seriously weakened. This has to change. Ladies, to turn this situation around, you have to embrace and promote a definition of womanhood that requires women to do things to qualify for it. That's how you raise the standard. We have to jettison the white media's childish and immature definition that womanhood is based on how much you can get a man to spend on you. That's good for corporations because that helps their bottom line, and that's the point of them promoting it. But it's horrible for relationships. What's also been equally catastrophic is the feminist assertion that womanhood is based exclusively on how much a woman fights with or defies her man because that's how she proves her independence. Feminist hood rats and other bad actors will often say, "You just can't handle a strong black woman." Well, a strong black woman is a woman of character and integrity, and she's also a woman who understands the need to cooperate. A strong black woman doesn't need to be handled. She handles herself. And that's not even an issue of womanhood. That's just an issue of adulthood. That's just an issue of basic maturity. Yesterday I told you that a black man who is quarrelsome is not a strong man at all. Well, this goes triple for black women. A black woman who is always making demands, who's always arguing about something, who just can't seem to make it through her day without giving her man a piece of her mind, is a woman not worth being with, because she's weak. Arguing with your man over every little thing is not strength. Children fuss over nothing. Adults only voice their disagreement when it's serious, not simply because they have a different idea. A strong black woman doesn't gossip or backbite, not against her man nor anyone else. Women who make it a habit to talk behind other people's backs are cowards. That's weakness. They also bring conflict and confrontation directly to their own front door, and it's usually the man who has to deal with it. There's a reason why gossiping has always been a near crime in most societies. Whisper campaigns undermine the solidarity that groups need in order to function. Weak women think it's cute to act like that. But most of all, a strong black woman knows how to cooperate, how to follow instructions and can be counted on to carry out her tasks. Effective soldiers are what wins wars. We need you to be at your best so we can be at ours. A man's strength is largely external, and it's based on how much he can influence his surroundings, to make them a product of his own will and effort. A woman's strength, however, is internal. It's not about controlling her environment, it's about controlling herself. She controls her actions and her words. She controls who she allows herself to be influenced by, personally and in every other way. The last 100 years has done a lot of damage to the balance of the natural order of gender relations, and especially to those between black men and women. But I'm convinced that there's nothing we can't fix if enough of us are committed. And regardless of all the white media fantasies that have poisoned the well, or the would-be dating gurus and other wannabe experts who are experts of nothing, I know that black women can shake off the propaganda and return to a basis of interacting with black men based on what will empower us as a community. I think the time is right for womanhood to make a righteous comeback, and not just some weak, vaporous, indistinct kind of idea, but a strongly worded, firmly defined standard. I think that we're nearing that point when a critical mass of black women will make it clear that they're turning their backs on the last 100-year experiment in licentiousness. I think we will see a large number of black women show the world that they don't respect weakness. They only respect strength, starting with strength in themselves. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Antonio Daniels, C. Hamilton Properties, Liban Gurhan, Herman Breckenridge, and Wendell. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.